Good evening, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I am Gabriel Miller, the Executive Director of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I am pleased to welcome you to our final Big Thinking lecture. I would first like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather to hold the 2018 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences is Treaty 4 land, the territories of the Nehi-Owak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. We're very grateful for the hard work and preparations for Congress undertaken by the University of Regina, who have been incredible hosts. And we thank them and the Indigenous communities in Regina for welcoming us here and for taking such good care of us. I'd like to remind you, before we start, there is simultaneous interpretation for English and French available. You can pick up a headset in the hall just outside the theater. Je souhaite remercier les parrains de la série de causeries Voix Grand, Conseil des recherches en sciences humaines, la Fondation canadienne pour l'innovation et Université Canada pour leur soutien généreux. I would particularly like to highlight this evening's lecture sponsor, Universities Canada, for bringing us the opportunity to be part of an inspiring talk. It is thanks to the generosity of these sponsors that we are able to make these events open to the public for all to enjoy. The Big Thinking Lecture Series gives us a chance to engage in thoughtful conversations about pressing issues of our time, and tonight is no exception. We are delighted to welcome Alaa Murabit, who will, no doubt, make us think deeply as she discusses emerging security issues and how women's local leadership drives sustainable change. I would now like to invite Perry Johnston, Vice President, Policy and Public Affairs with Universities Canada, to introduce Alaa Murabit.
Well, thank you, Gabriel. Good evening, everyone, et bonjour à tous. I also want to acknowledge my real pleasure at being here on Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis. As Gabriel said, I'm Perry Johnston, Vice President of Policy and Public Affairs at Universities Canada. Et pour les personnes qui ne le sauraient pas, Université Canada est l'association nationale qui représente 96 universités canadiennes au pays et à l'étranger. So I'm here representing Canada's universities from across the country. We have 96 members. We're based in Ottawa. And I'm really pleased to be here representing our association as a sponsor of the Big Thinking series. It's particularly special for me to be here because the University of Regina is actually my alma mater. I grew up here in Regina, and it's been really nice to be back and see the change and the dynamism of this campus. It was many years ago that I was here as a French literature student. But one thing that I've noticed that has been so different from when I was here before is how dynamic and how diverse this campus is. And it really embodies what I like to call a 21st century university. And I really want to congratulate Dr. Vianne Timmins, who I know has played a huge role over the course of the week and with her team helping organize Congress this year at the University of Regina. And I want to thank her for her outstanding commitment to hosting Congress and to her leadership over the past 10 years of this university and her national leadership on behalf of Canada's universities. Congress is an enormous undertaking, and it's an incredible opportunity to gather Canada's social sciences and humanities scholars in one place. And I really want to underscore my congratulations to the organizers and thanks to all the volunteers who've been incredible. It's really been nice to meet a lot of the volunteers in their green shirts who've been so helpful over the last couple of days. I want to thank the leadership and acknowledge the important role that the Federation's Executive Director, Gabriel Miller, and the Board Chair, Guy Laforêt, have made in pushing and advancing the national cause of the value of the social sciences and humanities to Canada's future. The Big Thinking series is always a highlight of Congress, and one of the most important roles of Canada's universities is to take knowledge, ideas, and research beyond the academy and into the public sphere. And I think we had a really good talk today from Françoise Baylis about why she thinks that is so important. This year's Big Thinking speakers are an incredible group of inspiring women leaders who are at the top of their fields and who are making change within and beyond the academy. And who better to showcase the role of the university as a forum for ideas and innovative thinking than these outstanding women leaders. And I want to really thank Dr. Timmons and the Congress organizers for programming an all-women lineup of Big Thinking speakers for 2018. It's a first, actually, and it's a powerful statement at a time when there's still so much work to be done to ensure diverse women's voices are heard and heeded in the university community and beyond. And this is an issue of national importance that Canada's universities and Universities Canada as the association takes very seriously. We're working with our 96 members to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion, including the need to support and promote women's leadership within the academy. And to signal our public commitment, in October of last year, our members adopted a set of 7 principles to advance EDI on campus and in the broader society in Canada. And it is accompanied by an action plan over the next 5 years to make quantifiable progress within the academy. So the higher education community is our sphere of influence, but we need to ensure women's voices and perspectives are lifted up, listened to, and celebrated in all parts of society, which is why I am delighted to introduce Dr. Alaa Murabit as tonight's Big Thinking speaker. Dr. Murabit is a true trailblazer. A physician by training, her passionate advocacy for women's participation in peace processes and conflict mediation has led her to become a globally recognized champion for the role of women in sustainable development. And as the G7 Gender Equality Advisory Council has noted, ensuring women's engagement at the front end of a peace process adds years to its duration and success. She's been appointed one of 17 Global Sustainable Development Goal advocates by the UN Secretary General, and is also a UN High-Level Commissioner on Health, Employment, and Economic Growth. She was recently appointed the Executive Director of Phase -1, a global organization that provides thought leadership in conflict resolution, inclusive security, peace building, sustainable development, and security cooperation. In 2017, Dr. Murabit was named the youngest woman inspiring change by Harvard Law School for her leadership in elevating the role of women on global platforms, and was also one of Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 in 2017. She also happens to have been born and raised in Saskatoon, though her career and education have taken her all over the world. And we were talking before tonight's talk about how often she is traveling around the world for the cause of her work. She's a true example of a Canadian change maker driving global conversations forward. We are delighted to have her here to talk about the role women can and must play in peace building and political processes, and how, in an era of emerging security issues and challenges, women's local leadership can drive sustainable change. We're truly privileged to have her home in Saskatchewan with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alaa Murabit. Veuillez accueillir Madame Murabit.
Hello, how is everybody? Exceptionally spread out, I've noticed. So the audiovisual team is going to hate me because I made them get, like a thing for the podium, because I don't like podiums because everybody can tell I'm 5'2" and I look like a talking head on cable news. And instead I'm going to roam. So I put them through a lot of work, but I just don't love the podiums. So I'm exceptionally excited to be here with you all tonight. I know I was supposed to be speaking, as many of you may know, in the lunch session, and we had moved it. And that is because of an adventure I am going to actually share with you, because I feel like we're all in it together. But I was in Amsterdam teaching a course at the University of Maastricht on, interestingly enough, securitization and peace building, effective peace building. And I was flying through London to get here to Regina in time to do my speech. And London was a deliberate pick because, see, my team felt I should fly through Paris. Now, how many of you have flown on Air France before? How many of you found your bags afterwards? Like, how many of you arrived in one piece? Because me and Air France, we have not bonded in a way that has worked for my career. And so I said, no, I'm going to fly through London. British Airways connects to Air Canada. This is going to be seamless. And then London decided to have some random storm after having like plus 30 weather the entire week before, so good looking out. And I showed up at the airport. My flight from Amsterdam arrived 4 hours late. The flight to Vancouver had taken off because apparently the terminal where the North American flights were is the only one that wasn't storming. And I was at Heathrow Airport asking them, okay, what do we do? And they said, don't worry about it. Where are you going? And I said, Regina. And they said, sorry, where? I said, Regina. It's in Saskatchewan. Uh-huh, yeah. And I was like, in Canada? And they're like, oh, we got you. So step number one was try to find a flight to Canada that was not full. And we figured that out relatively quickly. They could get me to Calgary or Toronto next day. So yeah, I'd miss my talk, but only maybe by like an hour. But my God, flying to Regina. How many of you had to fly in here? Bless you all. I feel like I genuinely feel like we're like comrades in war. And I'm either underestimating war or underestimating flying to Regina, because to get a flight to Regina was nearly impossible. It would have had me in tonight at 8 p.m. So my team, now my parents used to live in Saskatoon. They've since moved to Vancouver. But my team was used to always booking me flights for Saskatoon. So they said, well, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Regina. And they said, where? And I said, it's in Saskatchewan. So naturally, the first thing my team did, because clearly they listened to me very well, I'm glad we're talking about leadership today, and they found flights to Saskatoon. Like, don't worry, we got you covered. I was like, first off, my parents moved over a year ago. Let's get this together. And second off, there's a lot of flights to Saskatoon. And they said, yeah, you can just drive to Regina. So we flew into Saskatoon, drove to Regina, and here we are. Thank you. So if after this, one of you does not find the cure to AIDS and solve world peace, then this speech was, the entire journey was just fruitless. I have high expectations. The ball is in your court. So I was born and raised in Saskatoon. I believe that was mentioned. Interestingly enough, I was born actually at home. My mom could not get to the hospital in time. It is a story that has ensured that my mom can get almost anything out of me that she wants for the past 28 years. All she says is, I had you at home. And I'm like, fine, let's do whatever you want to do. Deal. And I have 10 brothers and sisters. So 5 brothers, 5 sisters, 6 girls. Because even as children, we were very strategic and ensured that we would win. And I am the perfect middle child. Yeah. Now I know I'm talking to probably some sociologists, some psychologists, and you guys have opinions about middle children. Yeah, I know, and you guys are fundamentally wrong in every way. And unless you are a middle child, I don't think your opinion is relevant. I'm going to be honest. I'm just going to put it out there. I believe in science and empirical evidence, but anything that tells you that middle children are more difficult is fundamentally flawed, simply because there are usually more middle children than there are oldest and youngest. I mean, it's a flaw in the way that you've collected the data, not in the middle children. But that being said, so I moved from Canada to Libya when I was 15. I had known, actually from a very young age, that I wanted to be a doctor. My dad is a surgeon. My oldest sister is this superhero of surgeons. She was the first, I remember, woman in our community to graduate from medicine, and then she went into plastic surgery because the shoes weren't big enough to fill for us. And she did that all by the time she was 21, I think. She entered medical school 18, was done by 22. Sorry, 22. And even as she was in medical school, her other professors would urge her to join their department. They'd be like, oh, forget medicine, be in math, which is never a good argument, ever. Like, I don't know who would go for that, but that's how big the shoes were. But it was also that I would come home and I would hear about medicine almost all the time. And the hospital acted almost as how many of you guys went to child care, like after school care in your schools? Anybody? One person? Well, I'm sorry, you were all like so well taken care of. Okay, there was 11 of us. We needed some sort of after school program. And ours was actually, interestingly enough, usually the hospital, if I had to go anywhere. So I grew up seeing surgery and really identifying doctors as leaders. not just leaders, but more, well, we'll get into that in a second. So I grew up identifying with doctors as leaders, as people who would sacrifice and put other people first rather than themselves. Now, if I asked you guys, what is the holiest place you know or you identify with, what would your answers be? Feel free to yell them out. What is the holiest place? Jerusalem, okay? What else? Rome. They don't have to be cities. They can be physical locations as well. Sorry? Okay, so Mecca. Where else? Home? Okay, I've never had that answer before. I've asked this question to a lot of people. You and I should talk later. I think there's some conversation that needs to be had. So interestingly enough, most people say home, the church, synagogue, temple, mosque, etc. And for me, the most holy place, and once you hear my argument, I think you'll agree, was always the hospital. Because I genuinely believe that the walls of a hospital have heard more prayers than any congregation. And if you go into a hospital chapel, you will find every faith sitting next to each other, all praying in the same place. Nobody's arguing, it is to me the most human place. And so I fell in love with medicine very quickly. And I decided I was going to be a doctor. When I was 15, I finished high school. And I figured instead of waiting for 4 to 8 years until I was old enough here and I would be accepted because I wouldn't be seen as too young, etc., I went to Libya and I started medical school there. In my final year of medical school, when I was 21, I founded an organization called the Voice of Libyan Women. The Voice of Libyan Women focused fundamentally on one thing, and that was ensuring that women were partners in the peace process and in nation building. And the basis behind it was actually data. It was looking at the empirical facts, recognizing that if you want to build a nation and you want to build it sustainably and you want it to actually still be a possibility in 5 or 10 or 15 years, you needed to make sure it was inclusive. And so the organization to me was common sense. I founded it. I told my parents, listen, I'm going to do this for 1 or 2 years until I ensure women are in every peace process. It's going to take me maximum 2 years. And then I'm going to be back to medicine. And so my story is, no, I'm kidding. And as you can clearly tell, that was not the case. It turns out a lot of people actually know the data and the statistics. A lot of world leaders do, a lot of security analysts and consultants and ministers of defense, ministers of public safety. And regardless of the fact that we know the data, for whatever reason, we can't seem to implement it. Not tangibly, and not sustainably, and not authentically. When we do attempt to implement it, we're not resourcing it. We're not educating people about it. And so most efforts are lackluster and very temporary. So with VLW, we started numerous global campaigns that really focused on the inclusion of women. And from that, I was asked to advise the UN Security Council on something called Resolution 1325. Now, Resolution 1325 is a resolution that is also called Women, Peace, and Security. And it talks about the importance of women's inclusion in peace and conflict resolution. Now, that was probably the first time my eyes opened up to what I think is a much larger global challenge. Because up until then, I had assumed that people just didn't know about the importance of women's inclusion. That this wasn't something people thought about in times of insecurity. But if they heard it, if they heard the data and the statistics and the facts, then they would be on board. In my opinion, it took one logical conversation. And the reality, and I'm assuming many of you may have worked in spaces where you've either studied or know intimately the reality of changing culture, but the reality is that it's fundamentally different. And it all started with one important question. When I was 22, we were doing a consultation. One of the people in our consulting group, at the time a minister of defense, said to me, well, you're talking about including these women, but who are these women? Are they really leaders? And I asked, well, explain because in his opinion, clearly they weren't. And I said, explain your definition here. And he said, well, why don't you Google the greatest leaders of all time? So that's what I did. This is the homepage of Google when you type in greatest leaders of all time. Anybody have any opinion on this? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone have any comment? Anything that you would like to point out about this particular set of pictures? Sorry? I'm so surprised you noticed that. It's just so easy to overlook with all that diversity there. Yeah, so every single person on the greatest leaders of all time is all men. And I think the guy in the corner is supposed to be Jesus. That's what everybody else I've kind of figured out who they are. That guy in the corner, I think that's an actor who got put on this list because of who he portrayed. So talk about minimal effort, maximum impact, right? That's what I would like to go for. But so this is the screenshot of the greatest leaders of all time. And this to him was proof that women are not inherently leaders. We don't have leadership qualities. Clearly, we have not made an impact on history. Now, this was interesting to me for multiple reasons. Because it was the first time that it was actually said outright to me. A lot of people have those unconscious biases or those conscious biases, but are a lot more careful about wording them, particularly people in my field, in diplomacy and policy. This was the first time somebody explicitly said, listen, you're kind of wasting your time. I don't think you're talking to me, I don't even think you have leadership qualities. You're asking me to bring a whole bunch of other women? I'm humoring this meeting. So this was the first time it was said to me so explicitly. And the second reason I found it very interesting, well, because it begs a question. If you are 6 years old and writing an essay for school, or if you are 22 and writing a report for a conference, and you search greatest leaders of all time, this is the answer you're getting. This is it. This is the answer. When I was in grade 6, I remember we were asked to write a report on the greatest Canadian of all time. Any guesses who I chose? No. No. You and I need to talk if you still think that. I mean, no? That was a close one. I mean, I feel like you guys weren't listening to the first 10 minutes of my speech where I talked about how much I love medicine and... No, close. Tommy Douglas. Who said Tommy Douglas? Give her a round of applause. I feel like given that we're in Saskatchewan, everybody should know that. I'll expect 10 pages on Tommy Douglas. No, I'm kidding. But so Tommy Douglas is who I wrote mine on. And I still remember when I was given that list, and I've tried to find it, and I've actually asked my elementary school about it. They don't even remember the assignment, let alone my teacher. But given the list of leaders, there weren't that many women's names on it in the first place. So I think many of you probably, but much of my work is centered around being able to prove what you say. I can't simply walk into a room and ask a defense minister or a prime minister to allocate a particular budget without having proof that those resources are going to something specific and what that output might be. And so I began to look at this in very much the same way. Oftentimes when we talk about women's rights, we talk about it very much in a moralistic sense. Women are equal, 50%, over 50% of the population. You can't, what's that saying? You can't unlock a door with one hand behind your back, which is a very bad saying, because I have tried that and you can. But there's a lot of moralistic, feel-good quotes about why women should be included. And to be quite frank, the moralistic argument should be enough. In a perfect world, it would be. In a perfect world. We clearly know it's not. A couple of centuries have taught us that apparently morality does not drive us to make the right decisions all of the time. So I began to assess what kind of statistics and facts and empirical evidence could engage people who felt that you were fundamentally wrong. Not people on the fence, not people who were like, yeah, there might be something here, but people who genuinely did not want to be having the conversation in the first place. Now, most of us think when we're having a conversation with a loved one or a friend or even a classmate or a colleague, and they're not getting it, that, maybe they just don't understand because, they're not as intelligent, they haven't done the research, they're not as intimately aware of it. I mean, we make up a lot of reasons for it, right? If you're talking, how many of you guys have gotten into a social media argument with somebody? Be honest. Yeah, okay, so Slowly the hands go up. It's like the question of shame. People are like, oh, maybe. But usually the reaction, and I hear it from people I work with, is they don't know what they're talking about. They're so backwards. We hear about our politics. I mean, 62 million people in the United States were called degenerates, as if that was a legitimate framework for people to be able to engage in discourse. So it was that polarity that I wanted to be able to address. How can we talk to people who in any other universe we would think are fundamentally flawed for believing in some of the things they do? And I sat down with a colleague who thinks very differently than I do about women's engagement. And I asked him, like, where does this come from? And his immediate reaction was like, no, you know what, I'm not getting into this conversation with you. You always get like angry and very feminist. And I was like, I'll try to reel the feminist in me in. But where does this come from? And he said something that struck me as very interesting. He said, listen, this is the way I was raised. This is the way my mom was raised. This is the way I was raised. And there's nobody who wants better for me than my parents. And it hit so many different chords because it was the same language I had heard in Libya when we spoke to mothers about, young marriage or educating their daughters. Same language we had heard around the world when we were in Argentina speaking about femicide, when we were in India speaking about girls' ability to go to school despite having periods, when we were speaking about literally anything that really engaged women and girls, it was the same reaction. It was not one that was out of hostility, but rather one that I think genuinely came from confusion, and one that came from a disbelief that you would question their love or their care for their family. Now, that's not for everybody, granted. But for many of the people that we worked with, that was the reality. So immediately I started to look at the data. I started with the thing I feel arguably most passionate about, and that's health. Now, who here can tell me what the most cost-effective and practical strategy towards climate change is? Okay, well, I feel like you kind of know that's the direction I'm going in, given the subject matter, so I'm going to make you try a bit harder here. What is the most cost-effective and practical? Okay, and what else could we call that? Okay, well, I mean, okay, birth control. Who said birth control? Women's reproductive rights. I'm glad we eventually got there. So women's reproductive rights, and what's the second? Somebody else yelled it out. Girls' education. The single most cost-effective and practical solution in the world, according not to a bunch of women's rights activists, but over 120 climate scientists, and it's written about in the book called Drawdown by Professor Paul Hawken, is girls' education and women's reproductive rights. It's not all the cool technologies. I know we all love Elon Musk, but it's not going to Mars. Now, who here knows some of the barriers to girls' education around the world? Who can give me 3? Sorry? Okay, what else? So sanitation. Transportation, okay, what else? Poverty, what else? Safety. Conflict, so insecurity in general. What else? Okay, so familial responsibilities. What else? The patriarchy, I like that. Just sum everything up. What else? Age, right? Age is a pretty important indicator. We see a huge peter off for women once they enter their reproductive years. And interestingly enough, something that nobody mentioned is geography. Most of the above-mentioned reasons that girls can't be in schools or don't have an education don't apply in places like Regina and Saskatoon, for the most part. So geography plays a very important role. What are some of the barriers to women's reproductive rights? Religion. Health, okay. I mean, guys, there's low-hanging fruit here. What else? Senators. I mean, that's fair. So politics. There you go. lack of education. So your two most cost-effective strategies towards climate change and ending the impacts of climate change are completely codependent on one another. In order for girls to be in school, their moms have to have less kids, and their moms have to be, to a degree, economically stable. And how do women start having less kids, and how are they economically stable? They get an education. If you were to educate 10% of the girls in a country, the GDP goes up 2 to 3%. And the economic growth that we could get from the education of girls is greater than the economic growth of China and India combined. When a girl is educated, she has less children. She's more likely to educate those children. She's more likely to vaccinate those children. And women reinvest, who knows how much women reinvest into their community once they're employed? What percentage of their income? Anyone want to guess? 90%. Women reinvest 90% of their income into their country. How much do men reinvest? You know, not to put you guys on the spot, but. Any guesses? 30%. Men reinvest on average 30%. Now, the reason I bring this up, the reason I talk about health and education before we'll get into security, is because you cannot talk about security if you have not spoken about health and education. The idea that bombs and bullets and surveillance and strategies are actually going to provide you with security is an idea that makes a lot of sense in Hollywood and literally nowhere else. It is flawed, and we know that. Our daily reality, the headlines you read, those are a reminder that the way in which we envision keeping ourselves secure doesn't work. Empirically, the best way for a nation to be secure is actually through the provision of basic resources with a particular focus on health and education. Wellness, not just health, wellness and education. Now, who knows what the single greatest indicator for a country falling into conflict internally or with its region is? What's the single greatest indicator that a country might have internal or external conflict with its neighbors? Unemployment, okay. Anybody else want to guess? The status of women. The single greatest indicator that a country will have conflict internally or may go into conflict with its neighbors is a decline in the treatment and status of women. That decline has to be stark, but that is the single greatest indicator, better than GDP, better than employment, better than levels of literacy, better than resource allocation, better than territorial tension. It is a clear decline in the status and treatment of women. Now, there are many ways in which women are unilaterally impacted by conflict, right? And we could go into all of those, but instead I'm going to focus on why there should be more women when we Google search. How long, this is going to start feeling like a pop quiz. I should have brought chocolate for all the success stories. But how long does your average peace process last? I'll ask it this way. In what percentage of peace processes will fail within 5 years? 90%. 90% of peace processes will fail within 5 years. When we include women in those peace processes, what is the likelihood that they will last 5 years? How much does that figure change? 50%. Did somebody say 50%? When women are included and you have inclusive peace processes, that peace process is 35 times more likely to last 15 years. 15, not 5. And the reason this is important is because anybody who's worked in nation building knows that 15 years means you can invest in schools and hospitals, infrastructure, and you really do create the building blocks for peaceful societies. So I'm going to, before we open up on Q&A, I'm going to give one small anecdote which focuses a lot on why the bulk of my work relates to women's leadership and why when I was 23, I started my own mentorship program for young women, particularly those interested in security and foreign policy. So when I was 21, I had founded VLW, and I went to I was 22 at the time, I think, my first big meeting at the UN. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have gone to like big meetings at the UN, but they like to make you feel very important. And so they give you this nice wooden plaque, and on the wooden plaque, your name is etched in white, you know, and you take a few selfies and you send them home to your family. But before this meeting, I had prepared an incredible amount. Because as many women in the room know, and arguably many minorities, and those of you who are younger in your professions, that you represent literally every community you are every time you walk into a room. And if you get something wrong, it means women and minorities and Muslim women and young people should all not be in that room. So you go extra prepared. So I walked in and I sat in my seat, which said Dr. Alaa Murabit, so it was nice and fancy, pulled out my books, and a young intern about my age, maybe a couple years older, came up to me. And she said, "Excuse me, that's Dr. Murabit's seat. And I hear he's very difficult." It's just the cherry on top. It's what you always want to hear. She said, "Why don't you go sit in the back with the rest of the support staff?" And so I picked up my things in a very out-of-body experience, something that I don't think I normally would do. I picked up my things and I went and I sat in the back. And it wasn't until my colleagues came and told me, "Listen, you need to come sit in your seat," that I went and I sat there. And I don't know, how many of you guys do this where you get into an argument with somebody and you weren't quick enough on the take, but you spend like the next few hours being like, "I would have said this," and that would have put her in her place. So the entirety of this big high-level meeting that I was so excited for, that I had looked forward to, that I had researched, that I came prepared with points, I instead sat there being like, "Well, why would she say that? I'm going to say this to her. I'm going to show her what's up." And over the course of that roughly 2-hour meeting, as I looked around the room, mainly to like find out where she was, you know, I recognized that every single person sitting at that table other than me was male, predominantly white, and I would say predominantly over the age of 55. And so when I went out to speak to her, and I was frustrated, I was embarrassed, I was upset, but I went out to speak to her, and even before I said a word, she said to me, "Listen, I am so sorry. It's just I never see people who look like me sitting at that table, so I just assumed. I'm so sorry." And it was the first time that I started to pay attention really to what kind of access we give, both to women, to minorities, to youth. What kind of access do we genuinely give? We all talk about it. We hear about it. The G7 will talk about it a lot. Everyone will say they're dedicated to women's inclusion, girls' education, women's reproductive rights. Everyone is on the feminist train to some degree, especially when it means some type of political pull. But what does it actually mean to re-architect institutions and structures, be it academia or the United Nations or security institutions, to ensure that people can actually have access to those spaces? Because it's not one intern that's the problem. It's the fact that an institution has taught her over the course of her time in that space what is culturally normal. So about 2 years later, when I felt I had the ability and the capacity to be responsible for it, I started a mentorship program. The mentorship program began with young minority women. It's expanded because I believe I have a lot to teach to young men as well. And a couple of our interns that I'm going to highlight have focused entirely on the inclusion of minorities or women in peace processes. Everything from writing a comic book for LGBTQ Muslim youth to looking at how religion is interpreted in our laws and policies in every country in the world. How, yes, some senators can pass laws that are fundamentally rooted in religious interpretation in secular states, and how some states can entirely omit the rights of women on the justification of faith. And the reason I end with this is because people always ask, the most common question I get asked is, okay, so the global security, great, you negotiate, etc. What can we do? I live in Saskatoon. I live in Regina. What can I do? And each and every single one of us knows somebody that when the shoe is dropping, we reach out to them for advice. Mentally picture, if everything is falling apart, who do you go to? Who do you go to and say, listen, this happened at work, not quite sure what to do. How should I go from here? My mother? You go to my mom too? I mean, she's fantastic. I don't doubt it for a second. But we all have somebody we go to, whether formally, informally. Maybe it's not even somebody you personally know, but when something happens to you, you go online, you look up their videos. I have a friend who's imagined that he's best friends with Stephen King. Not Stephen Hawking, Stephen King. Don't ask me why. That's the person he thinks he reaches out to for advice. But that's the person who has mentored you. And if you think really hard, there's probably somebody in your life who also comes and asks you. It might be your little sister, or a cousin, or a colleague, or a classmate. It might be a senior citizen. But somebody comes to you and says, listen, I need some help. And they might be very practical things, or they might be questions of their future. And what do you think I should do? And whether you know it or not, that's the person you mentor. When they mimic the way you walk, that's the person who is learning from you every day. So in that vein, if we all have mentors, and we all are to a degree mentors, wouldn't it make a lot more sense to formalize it? To talk about it more? To tell more people that, yeah, you know what, I'm creating space and access for other people in this space. Wouldn't it make more sense for us to say that the doors are open? Because leadership, and this is my favorite thing about this picture, I have been asked to define a leader all the time. I get asked to do it in work, I get asked to do it in articles, I get asked to do it in speeches. And there's a lot of social and academic reasons why people think others are leaders. The empirical evidence is astounding, not a lot of it matches up. And the best way to describe leaders I have found is that a legitimate leader, whether you think they're good as a person or not, but a leader will inspire others to lead. That's it. So Martin Luther King Jr., he had a lot of leaders behind him. There was a whole entire army of people who made it possible for him to go out and have the response that he had from his community. And for me, I talk a lot about how my dad is a doctor, and he's the one who got us really interested in medicine. But my mom raised 11 kids, and one of them went off to be a plastic surgeon, and the other went off to be a stay-at-home mom, and the other one went off to be me. And at the end of it, when you ask her, she says, I gave my kids the ability to make decisions for themselves and choose what they wanted to do with their lives. So that was the first leader I ever knew. And arguably the first person that would show up on my internal search. So who have you inspired to lead? How are you opening doors for others to be in the spaces you are in? And how have you ensured that in all of your work, personal, professional, you're not taking up the space of other people who should be there? Because that is what leadership looks like. Redefining the institutions that prohibit engagement, ensuring that your space there is not space for you alone, but for other people who do not yet have the capacity or ability to be there. And more important than anything else, getting out of the way when you know somebody has experiences or can do it fundamentally better. Thank you.
See if I'm on. Yes, I'm on. This week, when I've talked to Vianne Timmons, the president of University of Regina, she's always said what she hoped most for Congress was that it would be memorable. And when we met behind the stage, I had a feeling that I would remember meeting you, and watching your talk has certainly been a memorable moment for me. So thank you very much for that. We have some time now for people to ask questions. There are 2 microphones on either side of the stage. Donc, on a du temps pour questions. Vous pouvez demander vos questions, poser vos questions en anglais ou français. Please feel free to ask questions in English or French. Just approach a microphone. And when you do line up, I'll just ask you to introduce yourself, let us know where you're from, and then ask your question briefly if you possibly can. So I'll give people a chance to get up the courage to come and ask us a question. I have a few, so I'd like to start. I think maybe just a simple one, or at least it feels simple to me. We'll see where it goes. But when you look around the world right now, can you give us an example of where you're seeing leadership that you admire?
I think that's actually a very good question, because we'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of it that's making headlines, I suppose. I think probably the most inspirational leadership I've seen recently has been a lot of the work that's been done around climate. You find a lot of local community leaders who are really taking on that role. And what we've seen is that local community, and I don't know how many of you guys remember the climate conversation in like the late 90s, early 2000s, but it was also very moralistic. It was, this is our planet, we have to protect it, there's animals, there's species, etc. And there was a turn in that kind of mid-beginning of the 21st century where it became a lot more empirical. And a lot of people started studying it, and it got very factual. And that very deliberate change in rhetoric completely transformed the agenda. And you saw a huge surge in the way that politicians engaged with climate. You saw a huge surge in the way that budgets engaged with climate, because it now suddenly was spoken in their language. It became appealing to them. Oh, you could save how much money if you invested in green energy, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of the bulk of that push actually came from local leadership. And then we saw it transformed now into global agendas. And so that would probably be the best example I could give of something that has tangibly shifted over time. The second for leadership today is, we all talk about young people as being leaders. Some people say leaders of tomorrow, et cetera. I have my own opinions on that. And history has actually been written quite often by 20, 21, 23-year-olds doing incredible things. And I think that what we're seeing today, not just in North America, but around the world, I mean, if you look at Africa, 65% of the continent is youth. And we are seeing the single greatest economic surge in most parts of Africa right now. You are seeing a complete transformation. You're seeing it both from young people in those countries, but you're also seeing it from diaspora in other countries who are sending ideas back or collaborating, et cetera. So I do think the interconnectedness of the world has really highlighted how powerful this next generation is and how powerful they're being now.
Don't be shy. I know people are interested to know more. One thing another thing, and I've got a list of questions. I can go all night, so unless you want me to, you should definitely ask a question. One thing, I'm interested in how you see the influence of women playing out, and let me explain a little bit more. You talked about, at least I heard you talk about at least 3 things: economic growth, environmental protection, fighting climate change, and peace building, conflict resolution. And if you think about economic growth, I think it's intuitive to think that more people participating in the workforce, more perspectives, you could see the connection to growth. Reducing the number of children, consumption of fuel, climate change. What I'm interested in is your view on the role in peace, because it's dramatic. What is the influence of women that makes a society more peaceful?
Well, so interestingly enough, I think what we've seen from the data is that wording it like the influence of women or influence of men actually isn't provable. It's inclusive peace building. So it's the idea that equally men and women will be at the table. That peace cannot be sustained by 90% of one gender, be it male or female, because the perspectives and the challenges they're bringing to the table are fundamentally different. Now, if you imagine a conflict country and you're working through the process of a peace treaty, what you're looking at is you're looking at working with the warring factions, be it internal or external, and you're looking at working with civil society, advocates, oftentimes victims, etc. What we found is when you have those voices, particularly women's voices, because oftentimes they do make up civil society predominantly, but when you have women's voices at the table, they're asking about fundamentally different things. And the peace negotiator for Angola said this best. I don't remember his quote verbatim, but he said that when women came to the table, it was his biggest regret not bringing them in sooner, because when they came, they started asking about schools and hospitals and the roads to places and security within cities, whereas the warring factions oftentimes are asking about political reintegration and economic outcomes of the peace conflict. And we've seen that now play out most recently in Colombia, where it was the victims and the hearings of the victims that really brought about a lot of the most challenging questions, where oftentimes the warring factions were talking about territorial gains, or how do we reintegrate into the political space, or what's going to be kind of really the fallout for those who were engaged in conflict. Women were asking about, okay, so how much money is going to go to clinics? What are we going to do about roads to schools? Are schools going to be secure? And so they were two very, very important sides of the coin, but fundamentally different. And what we've learned is that those questions about schools and healthcare and really the basic building blocks of society are the ones that actually ensure long-term peace. You can solve a conflict. We've done it plenty of times. You can solve a conflict by agreeing to give people certain benefits. You can get this piece of land, you can get this amount of money, you can run for election, etc. But the second that piece of land is no longer the most attractive piece of land, or that money runs out, or they don't win that electoral campaign legitimately, they'll go back to war. And yet when you build those schools and those hospitals, and people are getting an education, and people are reintegrating into society, and families are reintegrating, that dynamic is fundamentally different.
I'm really interested in how the ideas you're talking about, how you've seen them playing out in the real world. And so, you talked about how investing in women's health and education, and I guess not just investing, but actually making progress on women's health and education transforms the society. Can you give us for you, an example that you're particularly struck by where we've seen a community or a country or a society make a real leap forward in terms of being able to go from a place where there was very little of this to where women's health and education was substantially improved? And can you tell us a little bit about what you think it was in that situation that helped bring it about?
There's a couple of really good examples here. I think one of them, a good one is Ghana in Africa. Another good one is Rwanda in Africa. Both of those countries have done, have made it a significant priority to work on girls' education and women's reproductive rights and women's engagement in ICT, and of course women's engagement in security processes. And we've seen that translate to Rwanda having the largest percentage of women parliamentarians and a very heavily dominated by women ICT infrastructure. So that's been pretty key. Where we've seen almost a reversal of it is when women were engaged in security, for example, Ireland, and then were able, because of their engagement in security and peace building, were able to push for greater change in women's reproductive rights. And we saw that most recently this week when they voted to repeal abortion laws, and a lot of that momentum was started because of their engagement in previous in the conflict previously. And then we see the exact opposite. We see where a lack of women's reproductive rights and a lack of education have created significant humanitarian challenges and political, for lack of a better word, political challenges as well. I won't use the other word. And we see that right now, most recently in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, where you have, at first estimation, within the span of 2 months, we had 400,000 refugees come to Cox's Bazar. At first estimation, 70,000 women were pregnant. We're now looking more realistically at 110 to 120,000 women being pregnant. in families where literacy is at a rate of less than 40%, women's health clinics and reproductive support is very minimal. So you have an area where it's led to an increase in infections and an increase in hostility and an increase in conflict within a very contained environment. So we can see it in both ways, both in the positive, in the sense that for most countries in the positive, it takes 10, 20, 30 years for them to rebuild. But you can see that really degeneration much quicker, and it takes a matter of months because it is such a huge strain on the resources and on the community.
Do you believe in natural leaders, born leaders?
I mean, if my brothers were here, I would have to answer this differently because we don't want them to get any ideas, you know. But I think some people are innately more capable of certain qualities, the same way some people are innately better writers, and some people are innately better, you know, soccer stars or whatever. So I do think there's innate qualities there, definitely. I don't think there's anything that you can't exercise, though. So, I mean, some people will have to exercise it a lot more than others. If I wanted to go and play on Barcelona and be, you know, the next coming of Messi, I would have had to start probably before I was born, and it still wouldn't be able to make it. But there's definite improvement you can make. Mm-hmm. And so I think while some people are innately gifted, I do think that anybody, I mean, and it depends on what you qualify as leadership. That's a huge question, because when we often ask people, so how do you define leadership? A lot of people will say things like courage, you know, the ability to stand up for your beliefs, you know, the ability to inspire others, all of those things, right? And ultimately what that distills down to is if you're, you know, standing up for your beliefs, that means you had them in the first place. So you're a person of value or morals or of some form of character. If you have the ability to inspire others, then you've probably had to listen to others, and you've probably had to be strategic enough to understand what others in your community need. So these are all skills and qualities that most people have. You need them to, you know, you need to be strategic, you need to be aware, you need to listen, I think, to live comfortably in a family with siblings. You know, you need to know how to negotiate, those all exist. I learned most of my leadership skills from having 10 brothers and sisters. And knowing that, you know, if my mom was mad at me, there was always somebody she wasn't that you could send in who could probably get what you needed. You know, like there was ways to get around things, and you had to build alliances so you could. So, I mean, all those skills and qualities I think are there, and you work on them. I mean, I don't know a single great leader. And you know, when you're younger and you talk about great leadership, for me at least, I always talk about people I know, I didn't know. So it would be like when I was younger, great leaders. How many of you remember Mr. Dressup? Thank you.
Sure.
Childhood hero, that man. But like we would mention kind of those great global leaders. So Mr. Dressup and Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. Yes, he's on, yeah. When I was a teenager, like slowly the Spice Girls, you know what I mean? So those were the people, but then as you get older, a lot of the leaders that you, I think, identify with most are people that you see daily. You see their leadership daily, their leadership impacts you, and you see how much they work at it. I mean, there are, you know, even within the advocates, we have phenomenal global leaders who will go into explicit detail about how long it took them to learn how to listen. And that one quality, to learn how to listen for the sake of listening, not for the sake of responding. Mm. And I think, so I do think those skills are cultivatable. I just think they take intention.
Mihaela Pieru from the Federation. Just 2 quick questions, please. Why do you think women play such an important role in peace building? Is there any correlation with the fact that perhaps they are disproportionately affected by conflict and war? And second, what do you think the biggest threat to peace building might be?
So the first question really relates to the question that was asked earlier. The disproportionately impacted by conflict and war is a natural assumption. Nothing that we've actually proved is causative, though. So what we have proven is that when we do have women at the table, it does change the topic of conversation that comes up. Oftentimes, the reasoning behind that is because they haven't gotten the same benefits as those involved actively in the conflict have gotten, right? So it would be a natural assumption, at least on my part, that when we do have women who are actively involved in the conflict as transgressors, they bring up the same things that men involved as transgressors bring up, because they were getting the same benefits and they have the same natural priorities to ensure that they get to maintain a lot of their power and control. So that change really happens when you bring in people who weren't directly impacted in a positive way from the conflict. what's interesting is it also goes the other way, that when you have women involved in peace building, in the actual peace building infrastructure and architecture, you have the least amount of crime against women in that conflict. So a good example again is Colombia, where because of the percentage of women that were in the FARC, Colombia is one of the conflicts that had the least amount of sexual violence against female citizens. So it works both ways, having women's inclusion in both senses. What's the biggest challenge to peace building? I think we talk a lot in silos. I think we talk a lot, everything is quite compartmentalized, both on a local and on a global level. I think the challenge is, man, I have so many reasons peace building is difficult these days. I mean, I don't know, I want to be an optimistic person, but it's fundamentally challenging because there are a lot of people who I don't think are necessarily very well versed in global security and peace building dynamics, but are volunteering their opinion. And are being given platforms like, Minister of Defense or Secretary of State, et cetera, where those platforms actually have serious implications. I think a huge challenge to peace building is the centralization of power. It's fundamentally it's way too centralized on a global level. A huge challenge to peace building is our global economy. A huge challenge to peace building is the way we've created our infrastructure, both on, for example, our multilateral systems like the United Nations, or the IMF. Those institutions are in many ways neo-colonial, and they do present particular challenges for developing countries. And on a more kind of local basis, I think the biggest challenge is people do not listen to each other. Our conversations, I think, have changed. Even in the 8 years I've been doing this, the appreciation for another person's point of view, whether you agree with it or not, the respect for that other person's point of view is very hard to come by in the same way. And I think that presents the greatest challenge, because if you're not sitting in the same room, whether you agree with each other or not, and trying to figure it out, it impacts so many more people, and people tend to rush and make very rash and, I think, unwise decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And one of the things that you briefly touched upon was the role of mentorship in your work. And I know that many of the people that are here in this room and at this Congress more broadly are teachers and mentors in their career. And I'm wondering, what are some of the characteristics that you would like to see more from people that are mentors? What do the people that you're mentoring want more of?
Oh, I think they want less of my jokes. Apparently I'm not as funny as I thought I was. But I think compassion. I think, so I'm speaking particularly a relationship that I have with some of my mentors. I think compassion, I do, because the mentors that I go to, I think, always, are not the mentors who always tell me I'm right. They're the first people who will tell me I'm wrong. They're the first people who will, very constructive criticism, but they're very compassionate, and there's an ability to listen and an ability to distill important information from a conversation in a way that I wish I could perfect. But yeah, I think compassion, and I think the second greatest quality I've seen in a lot of my own mentors is almost a reflection of self, if that makes sense. When I do present a problem to them, they don't address it as though it was my problem. They really do take it on and say, okay, well, if I'm walking in your shoes, these are the options I have. And the third best quality is one of my mentors, Yusuf Mahmoud, will actually, when I come to a problem, come up with a problem, and I say, listen, this is what's going on. He sits there, and I used to think he wasn't listening to me, because he'll say, okay, and? So what can you do? What are the options? And I realize it's a lot like my sister, who's like a psychologist, but in a mentor, it's actually quite nice to make the decisions for myself with their guidance. And so those are probably compassion, the ability to listen, and the ability to put themselves in my shoes, I think have been qualities that I've appreciated. I've tried to emulate. I don't think to the same degree of efficacy, but I've appreciated very much.
Thank you.
This will be our last question.
Hi, it's Susana Prado. I'm a social worker in Regina. I was wondering if you have some thoughts or ideas on what's needed for the healing of trauma experienced by women and Indigenous peoples in Canada.
I think that's a wonderful question. I think, and I'll be honest here, I don't think I'm the right person to ask. I think what's needed first is for us to be able to go to the communities that have been most impacted and ask them what they need. I think that's the same for any type of engagement in any community anywhere in the world. I work in a space where we often make decisions in New York or Brussels or Geneva, and then we go out and we try to roll it out on the ground without oftentimes listening to local communities. And I think we can globally agree it's a very flawed way to engage. I mean, there is nobody better equipped than those most impacted to say this is what we need. We need to be, and I would argue what we've seen in other countries is that oftentimes in order to heal from trauma, there has to first be accountability. It's very rare to find a community that has been able to heal without first having perpetrators be held accountable and having reparations to a degree. So there's certain, steps that we've seen empirically work, but that doesn't change the fact that it has to be the local community that says, listen, because this has happened to us, they now have the right to say this is what we need, either from this government, from provincial governments, from whatever. So step number one, I think, to healing communities is going to those communities and engaging with them and ensuring that they understand that they are in charge and that they are really architecting the framework of that engagement, not the other way around, which is how we've, up until now, worded things in Canada with the Indigenous community. And it just doesn't work. They're not our rules to write. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I'm going to say a couple of words to wrap up the session in a minute, but I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Murabit for a very memorable, thought-provoking, and inspiring conversation tonight. It's a token of appreciation.
Fancy.
And on behalf of the Federation, I would like to present you with a small token of our appreciation.
Fancy. So the next time an intern tells me to move somewhere else, I'll have an even
Exactly.
nicer notebook to take with me.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It'll give you the confidence to stay at the
Exactly.
UN table. I want to first, again, thank our sponsors for this series, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Universities Canada, and the Canada Foundation for Innovation. And you happen to be here for our last Big Thinking lecture. You also happen to be here at my last official duty at Congress 2018. And so I hope you'll indulge me when I just say a couple of things. I've been here for 9 or 10 days, and it's just been a remarkable experience at the University of Regina and in this city. It has, I want to say, exceeded my expectations, but that doesn't even quite capture it. It has been such a specific experience to be here. And I had already had an experience with Regina in the past and had friends and colleagues in the city, but it's given me a relationship with this community that I know I'm going to carry back to Ottawa, and I know that thousands of other people who've been here this week are going to carry back with them and carry with them through their careers and their lives. And I'm sure we'll find ways to make sure that they cross paths with Regina again. I want to make sure I recognize our friends from the University of Regina, including our dear friend and colleague and the academic convener here, Andre Magnon, President Vianne Timmins, who isn't with us this evening, but who was the visionary behind our all-women Big Thinking series this year, and I think that deserves a round of applause. Those lectures are all available, or will all be available on our website, the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences. And just as we prepare to close, I want to say that the Federation wishes to express its appreciation of the host Indigenous communities in Regina. We bear a collective responsibility to honor and respect their protocols and homes, and to meaningfully engage with their knowledge as an academic community and as Canadian citizens, whether in events such as this Congress or beyond in our daily lives. Thanks again to Perry Johnson and Universities Canada. We hope to see many of you, in fact, as many of you as possible at the 2019 Congress at the University of British Columbia, and in 2020 at the Western University. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of an amazing week. Have a wonderful evening. Merci beaucoup.